He thought he was alone in the forest when he collapsed, exhausted, after saving a wild kitten. But just when hope began to fade, a dog appeared, and what it carried in its mouth would change everything. A story of unexpected bonds, healing, and a second chance at life. This tale will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Now get ready, because this story begins where everything nearly ended. The golden hour cast long shadows through the Appalachian forest as Raymond Cole stumbled along the narrow dirt path. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one more labored than the last. The world around him, the rustling leaves, the distant chirp of birds, the whisper of wind through ancient pines, was fading to a muffled hum. In his trembling arms, a tiny wild bobcat kitten mewled softly, its grey-streaked fur matted with dirt and pine needles. The creature's amber eyes, wide with fear, stared up at the weathered face of its unlikely savior. "Hang in there, little one," Raymond whispered through clenched teeth. "You're safe now." His legs, which had carried him through decades of forest conservation work and countless miles of these very trails, finally betrayed him. One moment he was walking, determined to reach his cabin just beyond the ridge. The next, the ground rushed up to meet him. Raymond barely managed to twist his body to avoid crushing the kitten as he fell. The forest floor was cool against his cheek. The scent of pine and earth filled his nostrils as darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. The last thing Raymond saw was the kitten, now free from his loosened grip, taking tentative steps away from him before pausing to look back, as if uncertain whether to flee or stay. Then came a rustle from the underbrush. A large, shaggy dog emerged, a shepherd mix with intelligent eyes and mud-caked paws. In its mouth was something that made Raymond's fading consciousness spark, with confusion and disbelief. A thermos. His thermos. The world went black. 2 months earlier, Raymond Cole stood on the porch of his father's, now his, cabin, watching the morning mist curl through the valleys of Elk Hollow, Tennessee. At 62, his tall frame still stood straight, though the years had etched deep lines around his eyes and silvered his once dark hair. Hands that had mapped forests, rescued wildlife, and built conservation programs now gripped a chipped coffee mug, the steam rising to fog his wire-rimmed glasses. 3 months since he'd returned to this place. 3 months since the divorce papers had been finalized. 3 months of silence, broken only by the occasional phone call from his daughter Emily in Seattle, conversations that always felt like crossing a minefield. "How are you settling in, Dad?" she'd asked last Sunday. "Fine," he'd answered. "Just fine." He hadn't mentioned that most of his father's belongings remained in boxes, or that some nights he sat in the dark, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of a forest that felt both achingly familiar and strangely foreign. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a back porch that offered a breathtaking view of the Smoky Mountains. His father had built it 40 years ago, after Raymond's mother died. A place to escape, to heal. Now Raymond was following in those footsteps, though he'd never planned to. He'd spent his career as a forest conservationist, moving from project to project across the country. His wife Marianne had followed for 30 years before finally admitting she couldn't do it anymore. She wanted roots, community, grandchildren someday. Raymond had offered to retire, to settle down, but by then it was too late. The distance between them had grown too vast to bridge. "Mr. Cole?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Raymond turned to see Ellie Simmons, the director of the Smoky Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center, standing at the foot of his porch steps. Her grey hair was pulled into a practical bun, and her weathered face bore the kind expression that had immediately put him at ease when he'd first volunteered at the center 2 weeks ago. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, "but I was heading back from a release and thought I'd see if you were still planning to help with the inventory today." Raymond nodded, setting his coffee down. "I'll be there by 10. "Wonderful," Ellie smiled. "We're short-handed since Derek broke his ankle, and honestly, your experience is a godsend. Not many people understand the difference between helping wildlife and interfering with it. Just putting old skills to use," Raymond said, uncomfortable with the praise. "Well, we appreciate it." She glanced at her watch. "I should get going. We have a new fox kit coming in that needs assessment." After Ellie left, Raymond went inside to change. The volunteer work had been an impulse decision, spotted on a community bulletin board, during a rare trip into town for supplies. Now 3 sessions in, he found himself looking forward to the structure it brought to his otherwise empty days. The rescue center, located in a converted barn just outside town, Raymond lost himself in the methodical work of cataloging supplies, cleaning cages, and preparing food for the various injured or orphaned animals. He preferred the behind-the-scenes tasks, leaving the more social aspects to younger volunteers who cooed over the adorable residents and posted pictures on social media. "You have a knack for this," Ellie commented as she watched him carefully measure medication for an injured raccoon. "Ever consider working with wildlife full-time?" Raymond allowed himself a small smile. "That was my life for almost 40 years. Different capacity, though. More paperwork, less hands-on." "That explains a lot." Ellie nodded thoughtfully. "You move differently around the animals. Respectful. Cautious. Most new volunteers want to cuddle everything." "These aren't pets," Raymond said, perhaps more sharply than intended. He softened his tone. "They're wild. The best thing we can do is help them get back to where they belong." "Exactly our philosophy," Ellie agreed. "Rescue, rehabilitate, release. Though sometimes I think the animals do more for the humans around here than we do for them." Raymond didn't respond, but her words lingered as he finished his shift and drove the winding roads back to his cabin. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the hood of his weathered pickup truck. The radio remained off. He preferred the sounds of the forest to human voices these days. As he pulled up to the cabin, something caught his eye, a flash of movement near the woodpile. Raymond stepped out of the truck cautiously, squinting in the fading light. Nothing, just the wind in the leaves. But as he gathered his belongings from the passenger seat, he heard it, a shrill, unfamiliar cry from the edge of his property. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, desperate and pained. Without thinking, Raymond set down his things and moved toward the sound, his body remembering old instincts from years in the field. As he approached the edge of the clearing where his property met the forest, he saw it, a small, thrashing form caught in the twisted remains of an old fence, half hidden by tall grass. A bobcat kitten, barely old enough to be away from its mother, and it was trapped. Raymond approached slowly, his movements deliberate and calm despite the hammering in his chest. The bobcat kitten hissed, showing tiny needle-sharp teeth as its paws batted frantically at the rusted wire wrapped around its hind leg. Its grey-streaked fur was distinctive, unusual markings that reminded Raymond of ash smudges on snow. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, knowing the words meant nothing to the frightened creature but hoping his tone might soothe. "Just breathe, little one." Years of training took over as Raymond assessed the situation. The kitten was young, too young to be alone. No sign of a mother nearby, which was concerning. Either she'd been killed or she'd abandoned this kitten, perhaps sensing something wrong. The leg didn't appear broken, but the wire had cut into the flesh, and infection was a real possibility. Raymond returned to his truck for supplies. Thick work gloves, wire cutters, a small towel, and the first aid kit he'd always kept stocked. As he approached again, he formulated his plan, calculating risks and movements with the precision that had once been second nature. The kitten's struggles had weakened, its amber eyes now watching him with exhausted wariness. Raymond knelt several feet away, speaking in the same low, steady voice he'd once used to calm injured eagles and frightened deer. "Easy now. This will be over soon." In one swift motion, Raymond draped the towel over the kitten, immobilizing it gently but firmly. The animal yowled in protest, but the covering calmed it slightly. Darkness often did with wild creatures. With his gloved hands, Raymond secured the bundle while carefully examining where the wire had ensnared the small leg. 3 quick snips with the wire cutters, and the rusted metal fell away. Raymond worked quickly then, applying antiseptic to the wound before the kitten could fully realize it was free. The cut wasn't deep. The kitten had been lucky. "You'll be just fine," he whispered, releasing his gentle hold on the towel. The bundle exploded into motion as the kitten scrambled away, limping slightly but moving with surprising speed. It paused at the edge of the forest, turning to look at Raymond with an expression he couldn't help but anthropomorphize as confusion, before disappearing into the underbrush. Raymond remained kneeling in the tall grass, his heart rate slowly returning to normal. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but something about it had cracked open a door inside him that had been firmly shut for months. That night, Raymond placed a shallow dish of water near where he'd found the kitten, telling himself it was just a precaution. Wild animals should stay wild. He knew this better than most, but ensuring the creature had clean water while its leg healed seemed like the right balance between interference and abandonment. The next morning the dish was empty. Raymond refilled it and this time placed a small amount of raw chicken nearby. "Just until you're stronger," he told the empty air, feeling foolish for speaking aloud to no one. At the wildlife center later that day, Raymond found himself drawn to the medical records, reviewing protocols for treating injured wild felines. When Ellie caught him, he explained about the bobcat kitten, half expecting a lecture on non-interference. Instead, she nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you did everything right. Minimal contact, treating only what needed treating." She hesitated. "But if it returns and seems too comfortable around humans, or if the mother doesn't come back, you should bring it in. Bobcats need to learn hunting skills from their mothers." "I know," Raymond said. "I'm just providing water for now. Maybe a little food until the leg heals." "And have you named it yet?" Ellie's eyes twinkled. Raymond started to deny it, then stopped himself. "Ash," he admitted, "because of the grey streaks in its fur." "Ah," Ellie smiled knowingly. "The naming is always the first step toward caring too much." That evening, as Raymond sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink, he heard a rustling in the undergrowth. Moving carefully, he peered over the railing to see the bobcat kitten, Ash, cautiously approaching the refilled water dish. The little creature lapped at the water, keeping one eye fixed warily on the cabin. Raymond remained perfectly still, barely breathing. When Ash finished drinking and sniffed at the small piece of chicken he'd left, he felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Simple, uncomplicated joy. Then a twig snapped somewhere in the forest, and Ash bolted, disappearing once more into the growing darkness. As Raymond prepared for bed that night, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in months. He wondered if Ash would return, if the leg was healing properly, if there was something more he should do. These thoughts, focused outward rather than inward, were a welcome change from the circular ruminations that had dominated his nights since the divorce. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, Raymond heard a sound that made his eyes snap open, a low, mournful howl from somewhere in the forest. A wolf? No, Elk Hollow was too developed for wolves these days. A coyote, perhaps, or maybe someone's dog that had gotten loose. Whatever it was, it sounded lonely. Raymond knew that feeling all too well. Days stretched into weeks as May bloomed across the mountains. Raymond fell into a rhythm, dividing his time between volunteering at the wildlife center and his quiet life at the cabin. Each morning, he'd check the small clearing for signs of Ash, and more often than not he'd find evidence of the bobcat kitten's nocturnal visits, empty water dishes, untouched food replaced with pine needles, or once, mysteriously, a small feather. Raymond began keeping a journal, noting Ash's appearances, behaviors, and growth. The clinical observations gradually gave way to more personal entries as spring deepened. May 17th. Ash visible for 7 minutes today. Wound appears healed. Weight gain evident. Still no sign of mother. May 23rd. Ash watched me garden from the tree line for nearly 30 minutes. No longer limps. Brought down a small rabbit on the edge of the property. Natural hunting instincts intact. May 30th. Ash approached within 10 feet while I sat reading on the porch. Made eye contact before. Retreating. Found myself smiling afterward for no particular reason. One evening, as Raymond sat on his porch swing with a dog-eared copy of Thoreau, his father's, with notes in the margins he'd never noticed before, the phone rang inside. He marked his place and went to answer it, surprised to see Emily's name on the screen. "Dad? Is everything all right?" Her voice carried the slight edge it always did lately, as if bracing for bad news. "Everything's fine, Em. Why do you ask?" "Because you usually don't answer until the third try," she said, the smile evident in her voice despite the distance. "Mom was worried when she couldn't reach you last week." Raymond felt the familiar tightening in his chest at the mention of Marianne. "I've been volunteering at a wildlife rescue center in town. Must have missed her call." "A rescue center? That's great, Dad." The surprise in Emily's voice stung more than it should have. "I do know something about wildlife," he said, unable to keep the defensiveness from his tone. "I know. I just meant, Emily paused. It's good to hear you're getting involved in something, making connections. Raymond thought about correcting her assumption. He wasn't making friends, just putting his skills to use, but instead found himself telling her about Ash. The words flowed more easily than they had in months as he described the rescue, the healing, the gradual trust being built between man and wild creature. Dad, that's amazing, Emily said when he finished. You sound different talking about it. More like you used to. Before Raymond could respond, a sharp bark from outside caught his attention. Em, I need to check on something. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? He stepped onto the porch to see a large dog at the edge of his property, a shepherd mix with thick, somewhat matted fur and no collar. It was sniffing around the area where Raymond usually left water for Ash. Hey! Raymond called, more sharply than intended. The dog looked up, meeting his gaze with startling intelligence before trotting away into the woods. Raymond frowned. A stray dog could be dangerous for Ash. He'd need to keep an eye out for it. The next morning, Raymond woke earlier than usual, disturbed by dreams he couldn't quite remember. As he prepared his coffee, movement outside the kitchen window caught his eye. The same dog from the previous. Evening was sitting at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin with unnerving focus. Raymond stepped outside, intending to shoo the animal away, but it didn't run. Instead, it stood, tail wagging hesitantly, before taking a step forward. Go on, get out of here, Raymond said firmly. The dog tilted its head, ears perked forward, but didn't retreat. Raymond sighed and went back inside, returning with a bowl of water which he placed at the bottom of the porch steps. That's all you're getting, he told the dog. Then you need to move on. There's a bobcat kit around here that doesn't need your kind of trouble. The dog approached cautiously, drank from the bowl, then backed away several paces before sitting again, still watching Raymond. I'm not adopting a dog, Raymond muttered. More to himself than the animal, so don't get comfortable. Later that day, while sorting through a box of his father's old belongings, Raymond found a bundle of letters tied with faded twine. The envelopes were addressed to him in Emily's handwriting, spanning dates from the past 2 years. Letters he'd received but never opened during his last conservation project in Idaho, too busy with work, and too distracted by his crumbling marriage. Raymond sat heavily on the floor, the forgotten correspondence heavy in his hands. Why had his father kept these? Had he sensed something in Raymond's terse phone calls that prompted him to save them? With trembling fingers, Raymond untied the twine and selected the earliest letter. As he read Emily's words, updates about her job, questions about his work, concerns about the growing distance between him and Marianne, he felt a profound ache in his chest. I worry about you, Dad, one passage read. You've spent your whole life protecting other species, but sometimes I wonder if you know how to be part of your own. Raymond read until dusk fell, moving through the letters chronologically, watching his daughter's tone shift from casual updates to increasingly worried inquiries. The final letter, dated just weeks before his father's death, hit him hardest. Grandpa called today. He says you're not returning his messages either. Dad, whatever's happening with you and Mom, please don't shut everyone out. You don't have to face everything alone. Raymond carefully refolded the letter, his vision blurring. He'd never read these words when they might have mattered, when they might have changed things. A soft whine from the porch interrupted his thoughts. The dog had returned, now lying at the top of the steps as if it belonged there. I told you not to get comfortable, Raymond said, his voice lacking conviction. The dog's tail thumped against the wooden boards once, twice. Raymond hesitated, then pulled out his phone and called the Wildlife Center. Ellie, it's Raymond. Has anyone reported a missing shepherd mix? Large, maybe 3 or 4 years old. No collar? After confirming no such dog had been reported lost, Raymond reluctantly put out some leftover stew in a shallow bowl. Just for tonight, he told the dog, who wolfed down the food with the efficiency of an animal accustomed to uncertain meals. That night, Raymond dreamed of forests and falling, of Emily as a child asking questions he never had time to answer, of Marianne turning away. He woke to the sound of scratching at his door. The dog was still there in the morning, and so was Ash, watching from the trees as Raymond filled both their water dishes. The bobcat kitten and the stray dog regarded each other with wary curiosity from a distance. Natural. Enemies finding themselves drawn to the same unlikely benefactor. This isn't going to work, Raymond told them both. One of you will have to go. But as days passed, neither animal left. The dog, whom Raymond refused to name but had begun mentally referring to as Scout, after noticing its habit of patrolling the property perimeter, established a routine of appearing each morning and evening for meals before disappearing into the forest during the day. Ash, meanwhile, grew bolder, sometimes approaching while Scout was present, maintaining a safe distance but showing none of the fear Raymond would have expected. It was as if the bobcat recognized that the normal rules of predator and prey had been suspended in this particular clearing. June arrived with afternoon thunderstorms that drummed against the cabin roof and turned the forest paths to mud. Raymond continued his volunteer work at the Wildlife Center, finding satisfaction in the structure and purpose it brought to his days. Ellie had begun asking his advice on rehabilitation protocols, drawing on his years of field experience. "You know," she said one rainy afternoon as they updated feeding charts, "we could use someone with your background on staff. Part-time position just opened up." Raymond looked up from his clipboard. "I'm retired." "Mm-hmm." Ellie nodded, unconvinced. "And how's that working out for you?" Before he could formulate a response, one of the younger volunteers burst in, soaking wet and breathless. "Miss Simmons, there's a dog out front just sitting there in the rain watching the building." Raymond felt a twinge of recognition. "Big shepherd mix, shaggy coat?" "Yes, do you know it?" 20 minutes later, Raymond was driving home with Scout in the passenger seat, dripping water onto the upholstery. "This doesn't mean you live with me," he informed the dog, who seemed entirely unconcerned by this declaration. At the cabin, Raymond toweled the dog dry on the porch, surprised by how compliant the animal was. No collar, but clearly this dog had been around humans before. It was thin but not starving, and apart from some minor matting in its thick coat, appeared healthy. "Where did you come from?" Raymond wondered aloud, running his hands over Scout's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in contentment. That evening, Raymond continued reading through Emily's old letters, painfully aware of all he'd missed by keeping them unopened for so long. References to holidays he'd worked through, relationship milestones he'd acknowledged with brief phone calls, grandchildren his father had hoped to see, but never would. "Mom met someone," one letter from 6 months ago read. "His name is David. He teaches literature at the community college. You'd like him, Dad. He asks about you a lot. Says he admired your work on the Yellowstone Wolf Reintroduction Program. I told him you're not great at keeping in touch, but he says to tell you the invitation to visit is always open." Raymond set the letter down, a complex emotion rising in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a sharp awareness of how life had continued without him. He'd been so focused on preserving natural habitats that he'd failed to maintain his place in his own family's ecosystem. A soft nudge against his hand startled him. Scout had approached silently, resting his muzzle on Raymond's knee, as if sensing his distress. "I made a mess of things," Raymond admitted, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Too busy saving the world to notice I was losing mine." Scout's warm brown eyes held no judgment, only a patient attentiveness that somehow made it easier to voice thoughts Raymond had barely acknowledged to himself. "Maybe it's too late to fix it all," Raymond continued, "but I should at least try to answer these." He gestured to the letters scattered across the coffee table. That night, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Raymond sat down to write. The words came slowly. At first, explanations turning to apologies, then to genuine inquiries about Emily's life. By the time he signed his name, 3 pages later, he felt lighter somehow, as if the letter had carried away a small portion of the weight he'd been carrying. He addressed the envelope to Emily's Seattle apartment, then paused, remembering something from one of her letters. She'd moved in with her fiancé, Michael, last winter. Raymond didn't have that address. The realization stung, another detail of his daughter's life he'd missed. Reaching for his phone, Raymond hesitated only briefly before dialing. "Dad?" Emily answered on the second ring, surprise evident in her voice. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he assured her. "I just need your current address. I'm sending you a letter." A pause. "A letter, like in the mail? Is that so strange? From you?" "Yeah, kind of." There was no malice in her laugh, just genuine amazement. "You hate writing letters. You always said why write when you could just call." "Well, I'm trying something new," Raymond said, surprised to find he meant it. "I found your old letters, the ones I never opened. I'm reading them now." The line went quiet for so long that Raymond checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, Emily's voice returned, softer. Better late than never, I guess. That's what I'm hoping. After hanging up, Raymond stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain and pine. Scout lay stretched out on the wooden boards, while at the edge of the clearing, a familiar shadow moved. Ash, grown, noticeably larger in the weeks since their first encounter, patrolling his expanding territory. "Look at us," Raymond murmured to the night. "The strangest little family on the mountain." The word surprised him, even as he said it. Family. He'd walked away from one and somehow, without intending to, begun forming another of an entirely different kind. July arrived with blazing heat that shimmered above the forest floor and turned the cabin into an oven by midday. Raymond developed a habit of taking long walks in the early morning hours, Scout trotting faithfully beside him, while Ash occasionally shadowed them from a distance, a ghost-like presence weaving through the underbrush. The bobcat was nearly half-grown now, its movements more confident, its hunting skills visibly improving. Raymond often found evidence of successful kills near the property line. Clean bones, tufts of rabbit fur, once the feathers of a grouse arranged in an almost deliberate pattern. He took pride in these signs, recording them meticulously in his journal, proof that Ash was developing the skills needed for true independence. "You're doing great, little one," he murmured one morning, watching from the porch as Ash stalked a chipmunk near the woodpile. The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but never broke concentration from its prey. The chipmunk escaped this time, darting into a crack between logs. Ash sat back on his haunches, tail twitching in frustration. "That's how it goes sometimes," Raymond said with a small smile. "There's always the next one." Scout, lying at Raymond's feet, lifted his head to observe the bobcat with casual interest. The initial wariness between the two animals had gradually transformed into a peculiar tolerance. They maintained their distance, but the tension had dissipated, replaced by a tacit agreement to share the territory, and perhaps Raymond sometimes thought to share him. Raymond's letter to Emily had led to more frequent phone calls, the awkward pauses growing shorter, the conversations less superficial. He'd even spoken briefly with Michael, her fiancé, a soft-spoken man whose genuine interest in Raymond's conservation work seemed untainted by knowledge of Raymond's past failings as a father. "We're thinking about coming to visit in August," Emily had mentioned during their last call. "If that works for you." Raymond had agreed immediately, then spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious anticipation. His daughter hadn't set foot in Tennessee since she was 16, when she'd visited his father while Raymond was working in Alaska. The thought of her seeing him here, in this new life he was piecing together, filled him with both hope and trepidation. At the Wildlife Center, Raymond had reluctantly accepted Ellie's offer of part-time employment, starting with just 2 days a week. The work suited him, structured enough to provide purpose, flexible enough to allow him time with his unusual companions at home. "You're good with the critical cases," Ellie observed one afternoon, watching as Raymond carefully fed a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing, the ones that fight the hardest against being helped. Raymond grunted non-committally, focused on keeping his fingers away from the hawk's powerful beak. "They're just scared. Fear makes everything harder." "Speaking from experience?" Ellie's question was gentle but direct. Raymond glanced up, meeting her perceptive gaze. "Maybe." Later that day, while updating records in the center's small office, Raymond found himself describing his daily ritual, with Ash and Scout to Derek, a fellow volunteer whose broken ankle had finally healed enough for light duty. "That's wild, man," Derek said, shaking his head in amazement. "A bobcat and a dog basically sharing territory? Never heard of anything like it." "It's not friendship," Raymond clarified, unwilling to anthropomorphize too much. "More like mutual tolerance. They both get something they need." "Still, it's pretty special," Derek insisted. "You should document it. Not just for yourself, I mean for real. That kind of interspecies behavior would make a great study." The suggestion lingered in Raymond's mind as he drove home that evening, the windows down to catch what little breeze stirred the humid air. He'd spent his career documenting animal behaviors, publishing papers, contributing to field guides. Why not apply those skills here? At the cabin, Raymond found a package waiting on the porch, a delivery from Emily. Inside was a digital camera, far more sophisticated than his old field equipment, with a note, "For your wildlife photography. Can't wait to see what you capture, love, Em." Raymond turned the camera over in his hands, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. How had she known he was considering documentation? Had he mentioned it during one of their calls? Or had she simply intuited something he needed before he fully recognized it himself? That evening, as the heat finally began to subside, Raymond sat on the porch with his laptop, creating a folder structure for what he decided would be a proper behavioral study. The unusual social dynamics of apex predators in shared territory, he titled it, then immediately deleted the academic-sounding name, replacing it with simply Ash and Scout. As if summoned by his thoughts, both animals appeared at the edge of the clearing, Scout returning from wherever he roamed during the day, Ash emerging from the deepening shadows of the forest. The bobcat froze upon seeing the dog, muscles tensed for flight. Scout, however, merely glanced in Ash's direction before continuing to the porch, where he flopped down with a contented sigh at Raymond's feet. After a moment's hesitation, Ash continued on his own path, skirting the clearing to reach the water dish Raymond kept filled on the far side of the cabin. The distance between the two animals remained substantial, but the message was clear. Peaceful coexistence was possible, even between natural adversaries. Raymond raised the camera, capturing the moment with a soft click. Later that night, as a thunderstorm rolled across the mountains, Scout paced anxiously at the cabin door, whining softly at each rumble of thunder. When Raymond finally relented and opened the door, the dog bounded inside, shaking rain from his coat and immediately claiming a spot on the worn rug before the cold fireplace. "One night," Raymond said firmly, "just because of the storm." Scout's tail thumped against the floor, unconvinced. As Raymond prepared for bed, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin. Through the kitchen window, a flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and Raymond caught a glimpse of a small shape huddled beneath the porch steps, Ash seeking shelter from the deluge. Raymond hesitated, knowing the proper protocol. Wild animals should find their own solutions. Intervention risked creating dependency. And yet, 5 minutes later, Raymond had arranged an old storage crate on the covered portion of the porch, lined with a towel, and positioned where it would stay dry but also allow Ash easy escape in any direction. He placed it silently, then retreated inside without attempting to coax the bobcat. Through the window, he watched as Ash eventually emerged from beneath the steps, cautiously inspecting the makeshift shelter before curling up inside it, amber eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Just because of the storm," Raymond whispered to himself, echoing his words to Scout. But he knew, even as he said it, that something fundamental had shifted in his approach. The professional distance he'd maintained throughout his career was giving way to something more personal, more invested, and surprisingly, he found he didn't mind. The heat wave broke in early August with a series of thunderstorms that washed the world clean and left the forest smelling of wet earth and new growth. Raymond awoke one morning to find Scout had somehow opened the screen door during the night and was now sprawled across the foot of his bed, snoring softly. "This is getting out of hand," Raymond informed the dog, who opened one eye, thumped his tail against the mattress, and promptly went back to sleep. Despite his protests, Raymond had to admit that the cabin felt less empty with Scout's presence. The dog had gradually transitioned from occasional visitor to permanent resident, though he still disappeared for hours at a time during the day, returning with burrs in his coat and the satisfied expression of an animal following its own agenda. Ash, too, had established a more predictable pattern, appearing most evenings at dusk and sometimes in the early mornings, accepting the water and occasional treats. Raymond provided, but never allowing himself to be touched. The bobcat's territory clearly included the cabin clearing now, but extended far into the surrounding forest as well. Raymond's documentation project had grown more sophisticated. With Emily's camera, he'd captured hundreds of photos and even some video footage of the unusual relationship between the wild cat and the stray dog. There were moments when they seemed almost to communicate. Scout would bark once sharply at something in the trees, and Ash would appear minutes later, investigating whatever had caught the dog's attention. "It's not cooperation exactly," Raymond explained to Ellie when he showed her some of the photos. "More like mutual awareness. They're factoring each other into their decisions." "Remarkable," Ellie agreed. "And what about you? Are they factoring you into their decisions too?" The question gave Raymond pause. "I suppose they are," he admitted. I'm part of whatever this is. Ellie smiled. That's what I thought. You look different, you know. Since you started here, less weathered. Raymond might have dismissed the observation if it hadn't been echoed by Emily during their next phone call. You sound better, Dad, she said. More present. Is it the wildlife work? Partly, Raymond answered, surprising himself with his candor. And partly the company, I think. Company? Have you made friends in town? Not exactly. Raymond described Ash and Scout, surprised by how animated his own voice became as he detailed their behaviors, their growth, their peculiar dynamic. I can't wait to meet them, Emily said when he finished, though I'm guessing the bobcat won't be too thrilled about visitors. Probably not, Raymond agreed. When exactly are you and Michael planning to come? Actually, there's been a change of plans. Michael can't get away from work right now, but I still want to come. Is that okay? Just me? Raymond felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of time. Alone with his daughter, no buffer, nowhere to hide if conversations became difficult. But he heard himself say, "Of course, I'd like that." The day before Emily's scheduled arrival, Raymond hiked deeper into the forest than usual, following one of the less maintained trails that wound up toward a ridgeline overlooking Elk Hollow. Scout trotted ahead, occasionally circling back as if to ensure Raymond was still following. The day was clear but humid, the air hanging heavy between the trees. Raymond carried a small pack with water, trail mix, and his camera, intending to scout for locations where he might take Emily during her visit. She'd loved hiking as a child before the divorce, before everything changed. As the trail steepened, Raymond found himself stopping more frequently to catch his breath. At 62, he was in good shape for his age, but the combination of heat and exertion was taking its toll. Scout waited patiently during these pauses, seemingly understanding the need for rest. Near the top of the ridge, Raymond paused to drink from his water bottle and check his location on the trail map. According to the markings, there should be a scenic overlook just ahead, perfect for the kind of photographs Emily might appreciate. As he continued onward, a movement in the underbrush caught his attention. A flash of familiar grey-streaked fur, Ash, far from his usual territory. The bobcat appeared briefly between two pines, then vanished again, heading in the same direction Raymond was traveling. That's unusual, Raymond murmured to Scout, who had also noticed the bobcat and was watching with alert interest. The overlook, when Raymond reached it 10 minutes later, was more spectacular than he'd expected. A natural clearing at the edge of a steep slope, providing an unobstructed view of the valley below, the town of Elk Hollow visible as a cluster of tiny buildings beside a winding river. Raymond took several photos, then sat on a fallen log to rest and enjoy the vista. Scout flopped down in a patch of shade, panting in the heat. The peaceful moment was exactly what Raymond had hoped to share with Emily. As he reached for his water bottle again, Raymond noticed it was nearly empty. He'd need to conserve what remained for the hike back down. The realization was accompanied by a sudden wave of dizziness that caused him to grip the log more tightly. Heat, exhaustion. He recognized the symptoms from his years in the field, the lightheadedness, the excessive sweating, the slightly nauseous feeling. He needed to cool down and rehydrate, but he'd underestimated the difficulty of the hike and overestimated his own endurance. "We need to head back," he told Scout, standing carefully. 3 steps down the trail, the world tilted sharply. Raymond reached for a tree trunk to steady himself, but his hand closed on empty air. His legs folded beneath him, and he was falling, the forest floor rushing up to meet him. The impact knocked what little breath he had from his lungs. Through the ringing in his ears, Raymond heard Scout barking frantically. He tried to push himself upright but couldn't coordinate his limbs. "Just need to rest," he mumbled, though no one could hear him. As his vision began to blur, Raymond became aware of another presence. Ash stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with those intense amber eyes. The bobcat made no move to approach, but neither did it flee. Scout's barking grew more distant, as if the dog were moving away. Raymond wanted to call him back, but couldn't form the words. A terrible lethargy was spreading through his body, pulling him toward unconsciousness. The last thing Raymond saw before darkness claimed him was Ash, still watching, a silent witness to his vulnerability. Consciousness returned to Raymond in fragments. First sound, the rustling of leaves overhead, then sensation, cool dampness against his face, finally sight. as his eyelids fluttered open to a world that seemed too bright, too sharp. He was still on the forest floor, though someone had placed something soft beneath his head. No, not someone. Something. Scout. The dog was pressed against his side, a warm, solid presence. But there was something else. Raymond turned his head with effort and saw it. His thermos lying on the ground beside him, the cap removed. Water. He reached for it with a trembling hand, managing to bring it to his lips. The liquid was lukewarm but felt like salvation as it slid down his parched throat. Confusion followed relief. The thermos had been in his pack, zipped in the main compartment. How had it gotten out? And opened? As Raymond slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, Scout whined and licked his face, tail wagging with clear relief. The dog's fur was damp, as if he'd been in water. "Good boy," Raymond managed, his voice a ragged whisper. "You stayed with me." But Scout hadn't just stayed. He'd somehow retrieved the thermos. Raymond looked at the dog with new eyes, noting the intelligence in that steady gaze, the quiet assessment. "You're not just any stray, are you?" Raymond murmured. After resting and drinking more water, Raymond felt strong enough to attempt standing. Scout hovered close as if ready to support him if he faltered. The sun had moved noticeably in the sky. He'd been unconscious for at least an hour, possibly longer. The hike back down was slow and methodical, with frequent stops to rest and drink. Raymond kept one hand on Scout's back for balance, grateful for the sturdy support. There was no sign of Ash, though. Raymond found himself scanning the forest for the bobcat, wondering if he had imagined its presence at the overlook. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was falling. Raymond's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and his head still felt light. But the worst of the heat exhaustion had passed. He collapsed onto the porch swing, while Scout immediately went to his water bowl, drinking deeply, before returning to Raymond's side. "You saved me up there," Raymond told the dog, running a hand over his shaggy coat. "Somehow, you knew what to do." Scout merely pressed closer, as if to say the matter was settled and required no further discussion. That night, as Raymond lay in bed with Scout curled at his feet, he found himself contemplating how quickly his solitary existence had transformed. 6 months ago, he'd come to this cabin to escape, to withdraw from a world that had moved on without him. Now he found himself at the center of an unexpected web of connections, to Ash, to Scout, to the Wildlife Center, even to Emily in a renewed way. And tomorrow, she would be here. The thought no longer filled him with anxiety, but with a quiet anticipation. He had things to share with her now, stories to tell that weren't about the past. Raymond awoke to the sound of tires on gravel. For a disorienting moment he couldn't place the noise, then reality rushed in. Emily. He glanced at the clock. 11:17 a.m. He'd overslept, still recovering from yesterday's ordeal. Scrambling out of bed, Raymond pulled on clothes and ran a quick hand through his hair. Scout was already at the door, tail wagging in excited circles at the prospect of a visitor. "Behave yourself," Raymond told the dog as he opened the door. Emily was just stepping out of her rental car, her dark hair, so like her mother's, pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked up at the sound of the door opening, and the smile that spread across her face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Dad!" Raymond barely had time to descend the porch steps before she was hugging him, her slender arms wrapping around him with surprising strength. He returned the embrace awkwardly, then, with growing confidence, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling a knot in his chest begin to loosen. "You look good," she said, stepping back to examine him. "Thinner, maybe?" "Forest living," Raymond shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "How was the drive from the airport?" "Beautiful. I'd forgotten how green everything is here." Her attention shifted to Scout, who was sitting politely at the bottom of the steps, tail sweeping the ground. "And who's this?" "This is Scout," Raymond said. "The dog I told you about." Emily knelt to offer her hand to Scout, who sniffed it thoroughly before allowing her to scratch behind his ears. "He's gorgeous. And he just showed up here?" "More or less. Started visiting, then gradually moved in. He saved my life yesterday, actually." Emily looked up sharply. "What?" Over coffee at the kitchen table, Raymond recounted his experience on the ridge, the heat exhaustion, the collapse, Scout's remarkable behavior with the thermos. He downplayed the severity of the situation, but Emily's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Dad, that sounds really serious. Maybe we should get you checked out at a clinic." I'm fine now, Raymond assured her. Just needed water and rest. Scout made sure I got both. Emily didn't look entirely convinced, but she let the matter drop, turning instead to happier topics. Her job teaching environmental science at a Seattle high school, her wedding plans with Michael, her volunteer work with an urban gardening program. Sounds like you're doing well, Raymond said, feeling a mixture of pride and regret. Pride in the capable, passionate woman his daughter had become. Regret for all the years he'd been too distracted to fully witness her growth. I am, Emily agreed. But I've missed you, Dad. Even when you were impossible to reach, I missed you. The simple honesty of her statement caught Raymond off guard. I missed you too, he admitted. I just didn't know how to say it. They spent the afternoon exploring the property, Raymond pointing out spots where he'd observed Ash, though the bobcat remained elusive. Emily took photos and asked thoughtful questions about Raymond's documentation project, offering suggestions for analyzing the behavioral patterns he'd recorded. You should consider publishing this, you know, she said as they walked the perimeter of the clearing. It's the kind of interspecies relationship that doesn't get much scientific attention. Maybe, Raymond nodded. I've been thinking about it. Ellie at the rescue center says the same thing. I'd like to meet her while I'm here, Emily said. See where you work. The casual way she referred to his volunteer position as work warmed something in Raymond. She understood, without him having to explain, that he needed purpose, that retirement for him could never mean inactivity. As evening approached, they prepared dinner together, a simple meal of grilled vegetables and fish that Emily insisted on cooking while Raymond set the table. The domestic scene struck him as both foreign and deeply familiar, reminiscent of happier times, when the three of them, he, Marianne, and a young Emily, had moved as a unit, each person playing their part in the family choreography. Mom sends her regards, by the way, Emily said as they ate. She's doing well, David's good for her. Raymond nodded, surprised to find the mention of Marianne's new relationship didn't sting as it once had. I'm glad, he said, and meant it. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies begin their nightly display at the edge of the forest. Scout lay at Raymond's feet, while Emily sipped from a glass of wine, looking more relaxed than she had upon arrival. So, she said finally, are you going to tell me the real reason you collapsed yesterday? And don't say heat exhaustion. I've seen you hike in the Mojave Desert in July without breaking a sweat. Raymond sighed. His daughter knew him too well. I've been having some chest pains. Nothing serious, just twinges. The doctor in town says it's probably stress-related. And you didn't think to mention this during our calls? Didn't want to worry you. Emily set down her glass with deliberate care. Dad, I'm not a child anymore. You don't need to protect me from the truth, especially not about your health. Old habits, Raymond said, looking out at the darkening forest. I spent so many years being the strong one, the one who fixed things. It's hard to admit when I'm the one who needs fixing. Nobody's asking you to be invincible, Emily said softly. Just present. Even when things are hard, maybe especially then. As if on cue, a shadow detached itself from the tree line, Ash making his evening appearance. The bobcat paused at the sight of Emily, muscles tensed for flight. Don't move, Raymond whispered to his daughter. He's curious but cautious. They watched in silence as Ash assessed the situation, amber eyes reflecting the porch light. Scout lifted his head, but made no move toward the bobcat, maintaining the respectful distance that characterized their unusual relationship. After a long moment, Ash continued his approach, skirting the edge of the clearing to reach his water dish. He drank briefly, then settled on his haunches, regarding the humans with alert interest. He's beautiful, Emily breathed, barely audible. Yes, Raymond agreed, and wild. That's what makes him special. As they watched, Ash suddenly tensed, head turning toward the forest. A moment later he was gone, a grey shadow melting back into the trees. What spooked him? Emily asked. Raymond shrugged. Could be anything. Another animal? A sound we can't hear. His world is full of signals we miss. Emily was quiet for a moment, then said, It's different, seeing you like this. You were always passionate about conservation, about protecting habitats and species, but this is more intimate, personal. It is, Raymond acknowledged. I spent my career looking at the big picture, migration patterns, population dynamics, ecosystem management. I rarely stayed in one place long enough to know individual animals, to see them as I don't know, as having their own stories. And now, Raymond looked down at Scout, then out toward where Ash had disappeared. Now I'm part of a smaller story, but it feels just as important somehow. Emily's visit stretched from the planned weekend into a full week, each day bringing a new ease to their relationship. They established a routine, mornings spent hiking or working on Raymond's documentation project, afternoons at the Wildlife Center where Emily charmed the other volunteers with her knowledge and enthusiasm, evenings on the porch, talking long after the sun had set. "You're good at this," Ellie told Emily after watching her help with a rehabilitation session for a young raccoon. "You have your father's touch with the animals." Raymond, overhearing, felt a surge of pride he couldn't have anticipated. To see his daughter acknowledged for qualities they shared, to recognize his own influence in her gentle competence. It was a gift he hadn't known to wish for. On her final evening, Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through the hundreds of photos Raymond had taken of Ash and Scout. She'd created a cataloging system, organizing the images by date, location, and observed behaviors. "This one's remarkable," she said, holding up a shot Raymond had captured just days earlier. Ash and Scout at the edge of the clearing, not quite together but clearly aware of each other, their postures mirroring in a way that suggested communication. The spatial relationship here, the body language, it's like they've developed their own protocol. "I think they have," Raymond agreed, leaning forward in his chair to see the image. "They're not friends exactly, but they've found a way to share territory that benefits them both. And they both trust you," Emily pointed out. "You're the common factor." The observation lingered in Raymond's mind after Emily departed the next morning, her rental car disappearing down the gravel drive, with promises of another visit soon, perhaps with Michael next time. The cabin felt emptier without her presence, but not in the hollow way it had felt when Raymond first arrived. Now it was simply quieter, a pause rather than an absence. Scout seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, staying closer to Raymond throughout the day, occasionally nosing at his hand as if to remind him he wasn't alone. "I know, buddy," Raymond told the dog. "I miss her too." That evening, as summer's heat began its slow transition toward autumn coolness, Raymond sat on the porch with his journal, adding new observations about Ash's hunting patterns. The bobcat had grown remarkably in the months since their first encounter, no longer a kitten but a sleek, powerful young cat with a confident stride and keen hunting skills. Raymond had observed him bringing down prey with increasing efficiency, sometimes venturing to the edge of the property with his catches as if displaying his prowess. It was normal development, exactly what Raymond had hoped to see, and yet it carried a bittersweet quality. Ash was maturing, becoming more independent. The day would come when he no longer needed the water dish Raymond provided, when his territory would expand beyond this clearing. "That's how it should be," Raymond said aloud, as Scout looked up inquiringly from his spot at the foot of the steps. "Wild things should stay wild." The week following Emily's departure passed in quiet productivity. Raymond increased his hours at the Wildlife Center, began organizing his documentation materials for potential publication, and even joined a community dinner at the local Grange Hall at Ellie's insistence. "You're becoming a regular social butterfly," she teased as they drove back afterward. "Hardly," Raymond snorted, but he had to admit the evening had been pleasant. The people of Elk Hollow were straightforward and unpretentious, more interested in his knowledge of local wildlife than in his past accomplishments or personal history. At home, Raymond started a small project Emily had suggested, building a proper shelter for Ash's occasional use during storms, more substantial than the makeshift crate he'd initially provided. He positioned it at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by ferns and facing the forest, providing the bobcat with both protection and a clear escape route. Scout watched these preparations with apparent interest, occasionally carrying sticks or pine cones to the construction site, as if contributing to the effort. "Not sure what I'm supposed to do with these," Raymond told the dog, holding up a particularly sap-covered pine cone Scout had deposited at his feet, "but I appreciate the thought." 3 days later, Raymond awoke in the night to the sound of heavy rain hammering against the roof. A late summer storm had rolled in, bringing wind that bent the treetops and lightning that briefly illuminated the bedroom through half-closed blinds. Scout, who now slept on a dog bed beside Raymond's, lifted his head at a particularly loud thunderclap. "Just a storm," Raymond reassured him, reaching down to stroke the dog's ears. Unable to fall back asleep, Raymond rose and moved to the kitchen window, watching the rain lash against the glass. A flash of lightning revealed the yard, transformed into a landscape of puddles and wind-whipped vegetation. Another flash, and Raymond caught sight of movement near the new shelter. Ash, darting inside, seeking refuge from the deluge. The simple fact that the bobcat had chosen to use the structure rather than find natural shelter deeper in the forest felt like a small victory. As Raymond watched, another form appeared in the yard, Scout, who must have slipped out through the dog door Raymond had installed last month. The dog moved cautiously through the downpour, approaching Ash's shelter with slow, deliberate steps. Raymond tensed, unsure what to expect. The two animals had maintained their careful distance for months. Would the storm change that? Dynamic. Should he intervene? Before he could decide, Scout stopped several feet from the shelter, sat down in the rain, and simply remained there, a silent sentinel in the storm, not encroaching on Ash's space, but seemingly standing guard. Raymond watched, transfixed, as minutes passed. Finally, Scout rose and trotted back to the cabin, soaking wet, but apparently satisfied with whatever duty he had appointed himself. "What was that about?" Raymond asked as Scout shook himself vigorously in the kitchen, spraying water across the linoleum. The dog merely looked at him with those intelligent eyes, then headed back to his bed as if nothing unusual had occurred. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed the world clean. Raymond stepped onto the porch with his coffee, surveying the glistening landscape. Scout bounded ahead of him, circling the yard in a morning ritual of territory inspection. At the edge of the clearing, Ash emerged from the shelter, stretching languidly before beginning his own patrol. The bobcat and the dog acknowledged each other with a glance before continuing their separate routines, the careful choreography of their coexistence unaltered by the night's events. Raymond sat on the porch steps, content to simply observe. These quiet moments had become precious to him, the opportunity to witness a small corner of the natural world functioning in harmony, each creature following its own nature while adapting to the presence of others. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Emily, sending a photo of herself and Michael standing before a backdrop of Seattle's skyline, both smiling broadly. The message read, "Wedding venue scouting. Wish you were here to help choose." Raymond texted back, "Trust your instincts. They're usually right." Then, after a moment's consideration, he added, "Looking forward to meeting Michael soon." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Raymond noticed Scout had stopped his patrol and was standing alert at the property line, ears forward, tail straight. The dog barked once, sharp and clear. Raymond followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual among the trees. Ash, however, had also frozen, attention fixed on the same section of forest. "What is it, boy?" Raymond asked, rising to his feet. Scout barked again, then looked back at Raymond with an expression that seemed almost expectant. A moment later, Ash disappeared into the underbrush, moving with purpose toward whatever had caught their attention. September arrived with crisp mornings and a subtle shift in the forest's palette, hints of gold and russet appearing among the green. Raymond had settled into a comfortable rhythm, dividing his time between the wildlife center, now 3 days a week, and his ongoing documentation of Ash and Scout's unusual relationship. The project had evolved beyond simple observation. At Emily's suggestion, Raymond had begun collaborating with a zoologist from the University of Tennessee who specialized in interspecies behaviors. Dr. Lauren Kimball had visited twice, spending hours watching the animals' interactions from a blind they'd constructed at the forest edge. "This is truly remarkable," she'd told Raymond during her last visit, especially considering the bobcat's age. Typically, young bobcats establish exclusive territories and aggressively defend them against canines. But Ash seems to have accepted Scout's presence as beneficial rather than threatening. "They figured out how to share," Raymond had replied, feeling oddly proud, as if he'd had something to do with their peaceful coexistence. "It's more than sharing," Dr. Kimball had corrected. "There are moments of what appears to be cooperation. That's what makes this case study potentially groundbreaking." On a particularly golden afternoon, Raymond was photographing Scout from the porch when the dog's behavior suddenly changed. Scout stood rigid, facing the forest, ears forward and tail high. A single sharp bark cut through the quiet. Raymond lowered his camera, This alert posture had become familiar over the past weeks. Something had caught Scout's attention in the woods, something he considered important enough to announce. Usually, these alerts coincided with Ash's movements, as if Scout were somehow tracking the bobcat's hunting activities. But Ash was already visible, lounging on a flat rock at the clearing's edge, seemingly unconcerned by whatever had triggered Scout's response. Curious, Raymond stepped off the porch. "What is it, boy?" Scout barked again, then looked back at Raymond with that expectant expression he'd come to recognize, a clear invitation to follow. "All right," Raymond conceded, grabbing his walking stick from beside the door. "Show me." The dog led him into the forest, following a game trail that wound deeper into the trees than their usual walks. Raymond moved carefully, noting landmarks to ensure he could find his way back. After about 15 minutes, Scout paused in a small clearing, nose working the air. Raymond was about to suggest they turn back when he heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound somewhere between a mewl and a chirp. Scout's ears perked forward, and he moved deliberately toward a fallen log half concealed by ferns. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Raymond approached cautiously, parting the ferns to reveal a hollow beneath the log. Inside, barely visible in the shadows, something small moved. "Well, I'll be damned," Raymond whispered. Two tiny bobcat kittens huddled together in the natural den, their eyes barely open, fur still carrying the spotted pattern of infancy. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Scout whined softly, lying down at a respectful distance from the den, his gaze fixed on the kittens. Raymond's mind raced. Wild bobcat kittens, apparently abandoned or orphaned. The mother must have been killed, perhaps hit by a car on the nearby highway, or taken by a larger predator. Without care, these kittens wouldn't survive. Years of conservation training warred with the compassion that had grown in him since Ash first appeared. Protocol dictated minimal interference with wildlife, but leaving these kittens meant certain death. "We need to get help," Raymond told Scout, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining vigilant beside the den. Raymond pulled out his phone to call the wildlife center, only to find he had no signal this deep in the forest. He'd have to go back to the cabin. "Stay," he instructed Scout, who settled more firmly in place, clearly having no intention of abandoning his post. Raymond hurried back along the trail, mind already forming plans for rescue and rehabilitation. The Wildlife Center had protocols for orphaned predator cubs. With their expertise and his experience, these kittens had a chance. He was so focused on reaching the cabin that he almost missed the shadow that crossed his path. Ash, moving silently through the underbrush, a rabbit dangling from his jaws. Raymond stopped short. Ash froze as well, amber eyes meeting Raymond's for a long moment before the bobcat continued on his way, heading in the exact direction Raymond had just come from. "No," Raymond breathed, the pieces suddenly falling into place. He followed at a distance, careful not to disturb the bobcat. When he reached the clearing where he'd left Scout, Raymond hung back, concealing himself behind a large oak. The scene that unfolded before him rendered him momentarily speechless. Ash approached the den with measured steps. Scout rose to standing but made no move to interfere as the bobcat deposited the rabbit nearby. The kittens, sensing their mother's return, began making eager sounds of hunger and recognition. Their mother, not their brother or cousin or any other relation Raymond had imagined. Ash was female, and these were her kittens. For months, Raymond had been documenting what he thought was the unusual friendship between a young male bobcat and a stray dog. What he'd actually been witnessing was something far more remarkable: a female bobcat who had accepted a potential predator near her eventual nursery, and a dog who had somehow recognized and respected a pregnant wild animal's needs. Scout looked up from the den, catching sight of Raymond's partially concealed form. The dog's tail wagged once in acknowledgement, but he made no move to leave his self-appointed guardian post. Raymond backed away slowly, unwilling to disturb this delicate scene. His heart felt full to bursting with a mixture of scientific wonder and something deeper, more personal, a sense of having been granted rare access to one of nature's sacred mysteries. Back at the cabin, Raymond called Ellie immediately, sharing his discovery with barely contained excitement. "Ash is a female and she has kittens," he explained. "Two of them just a few weeks old. And get this, Scout knew. He's been helping protect them." "Are you sure?" Ellie asked, her voice cautious but intrigued. Bobcats are usually fiercely protective of their young. They don't allow other predators anywhere near their dens. I'm sure of what I saw, Raymond insisted. Scout led me right to them, and Ash brought food while we were there. There was no aggression, no territorial display. It's as if they've formed some kind of alliance. That's extraordinary, Ellie admitted. But Raymond, you need to be extremely careful now. This is a critical period for those kittens. The last thing we want is for Ash to feel threatened and move them to a less suitable location. I know, Raymond agreed. I'll keep my distance, just document from afar. But Ellie, do you realize what this means for my research? This changes everything. After hanging up, Raymond sat on the porch, journal open but momentarily forgotten, as he processed the implications of his discovery. He'd been wrong about Ash from the beginning, not just about her sex, but about the nature of her relationship with Scout. This wasn't merely peaceful coexistence between natural adversaries. It was a complex interspecies arrangement centered around the protection of vulnerable offspring. Scout returned at dusk, trotting up the porch steps to collapse at Raymond's feet with a contented sigh, as if he'd completed an important day's work. You knew all along, didn't you? Raymond asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. That's why you've been patrolling the property line, barking at potential threats. You've been helping her protect them. Scout's tail thumped against the wooden boards in what Raymond chose to interpret as confirmation. That night, Raymond called Emily to share the news, his voice animated in a way she hadn't heard in years. Dad, that's amazing, she exclaimed. So your entire study just took on a whole new dimension. Exactly, Raymond agreed. And Dr. Kimball is ecstatic. She says this kind of protective behavior between different predator species is almost unheard of in the wild. We're documenting something truly special. I'm so happy for you, Emily said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. You sound fulfilled. The word struck Raymond as perfectly apartment I am, he realized, for the first time in a long time. Michael and I were talking, Emily continued, a slight hesitation entering her voice. We've set a date for the wedding, April 15th next year, and we were hoping would you consider walking me down the aisle? Raymond felt a lump form in his throat, unexpected emotion rising. I'd be honored. There's one more thing, she added. We'd like to have the ceremony in Tennessee, near you, if that works. Here? Raymond couldn't hide his surprise. But what about all your friends in Seattle? And Marianne? Mom loves the idea, actually. She says it's time to build new memories in old places. And honestly, Dad, after visiting, I realized how much I've missed these mountains. They feel like home in a way Seattle never quite has. After they hung up, Raymond sat on the porch long into the night, watching the stars emerge above the tree line. The events of the day, discovering Ash's kittens, understanding Scout's protective role, Emily's wedding news, swirled together in his mind, creating a tapestry of connection he'd never anticipated when he first arrived at this cabin, broken and alone. Not bad for an old forest ranger, he murmured to the night as Scout dozed beside him, and somewhere in the darkness, a mother bobcat watched over her growing family. The seasons turned, summer warmth giving way to autumn's glory, and then winter's hushed stillness. Raymond's days took on a pleasant predictability, mornings at the Wildlife Center, now as a paid consultant developing education programs, afternoons documenting the growing bobcat family, evenings by the fire with Scout and the occasional dinner guest from town. Ash's kittens thrived under their mother's care, emerging from the den in late September to begin exploring their surroundings under her watchful eye. Raymond had named them, something he knew professional wildlife biologists would frown upon, but he couldn't help himself. The slightly larger one with distinctive ear tufts became Cedar, while the smaller, more adventurous sibling he called Juniper. The first time Raymond watched Ash teaching her kittens to stalk, crouching low in the tall grass at the forest edge, with the little ones mimicking her every move, he felt a sense of privilege that transcended scientific observation. This wasn't just research anymore. It was bearing witness to the continuity of life, to the ancient dance of knowledge passing from one generation to the next. Dr. Kimball visited regularly, bringing specialized equipment to document the bobcat family's development. Their collaboration had resulted in a preliminary paper, accepted by a prestigious wildlife journal, with Raymond as lead author, his first publication in nearly a decade. You've documented something remarkable here, she told him during her December visit, as they huddled in the observation blind, watching cedar and juniper pounce on each other in the light dusting of snow. Not just the interspecies dynamics, but a complete developmental arc for wild bobcat kittens. That's rare data. I got lucky, Raymond demurred. Luck is part of it, Dr. Kimball agreed, but so is patience and perspective. You saw something worth understanding when most people would have just seen animals being animals. Scout's role in the arrangement had evolved as well, as the kittens grew more mobile, exploring farther from their mother's side. The dog seemed to appoint himself as secondary guardian, often positioning himself at the perimeter of their play area, alert to potential threats. More remarkably, Ash allowed this. She maintained clear boundaries. Scout never approached the kittens directly, but the usual aggressive territorial behavior a wild mother bobcat would display toward a canine was noticeably absent. It's as if they've negotiated terms, Raymond explained to Ellie one snowy afternoon at the Wildlife Center. Scout provides an extra layer of security, and in exchange Ash tolerates his presence near her family. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for, Ellie nodded. They can adapt to unusual circumstances when it benefits their survival. It's more than that, Raymond insisted. There's trust there, real trust. As winter deepened, Raymond received a package from Emily, wedding invitations. Elegantly simple cards announcing the spring ceremony to be held at Elk Hollow's small lakeside pavilion. Included was a personal note. Dad, can't wait for you to meet Michael properly this time. He's excited about the fishing. Fair warning. Mom and David are helping with arrangements from Seattle. It feels right, bringing everyone together where it all began, where you found your new beginning. With love, MPS Scout is definitely invited to the ceremony. We've even ordered him a special collar for the occasion. Raymond found himself smiling as he tucked the invitation onto the mantelpiece. The prospect of having Emily married here, of Marianne returning to these mountains not as his wife but as a welcome guest, of his past and present converging in celebration rather than regret. It felt like the closing of a circle he hadn't known was open. January brought heavy snows that transformed the forest into a hushed white landscape. Raymond worried about Ash and her kittens, but trail cameras revealed they were thriving, the mother bobcat teaching her young to hunt winter prey. Rabbits, squirrels, the occasional grouse. One morning, after a particularly fierce storm, Raymond woke to find Scout unusually agitated, pacing by the door and whining. "What is it, boy?" Raymond asked, pulling on his boots and heavy coat. The moment he opened the door, Scout bolted outside, plunging through snow that reached his chest in places. Raymond followed, struggling through the drifts as the dog led him toward the forest edge. There, in the pristine white expanse, stood Ash. But something was wrong. The bobcat was limping badly, favoring her right front paw. Beside her, Cedar and Juniper huddled in the snow, clearly distressed by their mother's condition. Raymond approached slowly, conscious that even after months of cautious coexistence, Ash was still wild, potentially dangerous if she felt cornered or threatened, but the bobcat merely watched his approach. Amber, eyes reflecting what Raymond could only interpret as pain and uncertainty. Scout reached Ash first, circling her carefully, before looking back at Raymond with clear urgency. Up close, Raymond could see the problem. Ash's paw was swollen and bloody, a deep puncture wound visible in the pad. Some kind of injury, perhaps from a nail or sharp metal in the underbrush. The wound looked infected, angry, red spreading up the leg. "You need help," Raymond said softly, knowing the rational response would be to call the Wildlife Center, to bring in professionals with tranquilizers and medical equipment. But something told him that approach would destroy the delicate trust that had been built over these many months. Ash had come to him, had brought her injured self and her vulnerable kittens to his doorstep, rather than retreating deeper into the forest. Moving with deliberate slowness, Raymond removed his glove and reached into his coat pocket, extracting the small first aid kit he'd taken to carrying during his forest walks. He knelt in the snow, offering the open palm of his hand to Ash while keeping a respectful distance. "I can help," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But you'll need to trust me." For a long moment no one moved. Not Raymond, not Scout, not the bobcat family poised at the fragile boundary between wild and tame. Then, with excruciating slowness, Ash extended her injured paw slightly, just enough to signal acceptance of Raymond's offer. Heart pounding, Raymond worked quickly but gently, cleaning the wound with antiseptic wipes and applying antibiotic ointment. Ash remained perfectly still throughout the process, only the slight twitching of her ear tips betraying her tension. "Almost done," Raymond murmured, finally wrapping the paw loosely with a self-adhesive bandage. "This will protect it while it heals." As he finished, Ash immediately withdrew her paw, testing the bandage with a tentative step. She looked at Raymond, then at her kittens, then back at the cabin. Understanding dawned. "You need somewhere safe to recover," Raymond said. "Somewhere warm for them." Without hesitation, he walked to the small shelter he'd built months ago at the forest edge. He cleared the snow from its entrance and interior, then spread fresh pine boughs across the floor, creating a clean, dry space large enough for Ash and her kittens. "It's the best I can offer," he told the bobcat, stepping back. For several heartbeats, Ash remained motionless. Then, with quiet dignity, she limped to the shelter, inspected it thoroughly, and signaled her kittens to follow. They scrambled inside, nearly tumbling over each other in their haste. That evening, Raymond sat on his porch despite the cold, a thermos of hot coffee warming his hands as he watched the bobcat shelter from a distance. Scout lay beside him, occasionally rising to patrol the perimeter before returning to his post. "Never expected any of this when I came here," Raymond said to the dog, who looked up with understanding eyes. "Thought I was retreating from life. Turns out I was just finding a different way to live it." The weeks that followed took on a new rhythm. Each morning, Raymond would leave fresh water and small amounts of food near the shelter, maintaining enough distance to respect Ash's independence while providing the support she needed to heal. Scout appointed himself guardian, sleeping on the porch at night with his attention fixed on the shelter, alert to any potential threats to the vulnerable family. By February, Ash's injury had healed enough for her to resume hunting. Though she continued to use the shelter as a home base, especially during snowstorms, Cedar and Juniper grew rapidly, their play becoming more sophisticated as they practiced the hunting skills that would eventually ensure their survival. Raymond documented it all, his journal filling with observations, his camera capturing moments that few humans had ever witnessed. Wild bobcat. Kittens growing up at the edge of human habitation, neither fully tame nor truly wild, existing in a unique space created by circumstance and mutual need. Emily visited for a weekend in March, bringing Michael to meet Raymond properly and to finalize wedding arrangements. The young man, with his quiet manner and genuine interest in Raymond's work, quickly earned his approval. "You've got quite the unusual family here," Michael observed, as they watched Scout and the bobcats from the porch one evening. "I suppose I do," Raymond agreed, the description feeling right in a way he couldn't fully articulate. As spring approached, Raymond noticed a change in Ash's behavior. She began taking her kittens, no longer truly kittens but adolescent bobcats, on longer excursions into the forest, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. When they returned, Cedar and Juniper showed visible signs of growing independence, often hunting small prey on their own, while Ash watched from a distance. Dr. Kimball, visiting for what would likely be the final round of formal documentation, confirmed what Raymond already sensed. "They're preparing to disperse," she explained as they reviewed recent footage. "The kittens are nearly grown. Soon they'll establish their own territories, and Ash will resume a solitary existence. It's the natural progression." "I know," Raymond nodded, feeling a bittersweet pride. This had always been the goal, to witness Ash's family thrive and ultimately return fully to the wild. Success meant letting go. April arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and birdsong. The forest awakened from its winter slumber, and with it came the final preparations for Emily's wedding. Raymond found himself unexpectedly involved, offering suggestions for local vendors, helping arrange accommodations for out-of-town guests, even working alongside Michael to build a simple wooden arch for the ceremony. 3 days before the wedding, Ash appeared at the edge of the clearing with only one of her offspring, Juniper, the more adventurous of the pair. Cedar was noticeably absent. "He struck out on his own," Raymond told Scout as they watched from the porch, following his instincts. The next day, Juniper was gone as well, leaving only Ash, who seemed both leaner and somehow more substantial than when Raymond had first encountered her as an injured kitten nearly a year ago. She moved with the confident grace of a mature predator, territory established, survival skills honed. On the morning of Emily's wedding, Raymond stood at his bedroom window, adjusting his tie and watching the early light filter through the trees. The past year had transformed not just the landscape around him, but his inner terrain as well, reshaping his understanding of connection, of belonging, of what it meant to care for something beyond oneself. A movement at the forest edge caught his eye. Ash, sitting at the tree line, watching the cabin with that steady amber gaze. As Raymond observed, Scout appeared from around the side of the house, trotting to the midpoint between cabin and forest. The dog sat maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized their unusual alliance from the beginning. For a long moment, the bobcat and the dog regarded each other across the clearing, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then Ash rose, stretched languorously, and with one final glance toward the cabin, toward Raymond, disappeared into the forest. Raymond understood with perfect clarity. She was saying goodbye. Not forever, perhaps. Her territory would likely continue to include parts of his property, but the daily interactions, the shared vigilance over vulnerable kittens, the careful dance of mutual accommodation, that chapter was closing. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Dad?" Emily's voice called. "The car's here, it's time." Raymond took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. "Coming," he called back. As he stepped onto the porch, Scout fell in beside him, sporting the new collar Emily had indeed purchased for the occasion, a simple blue band that somehow managed to make the formerly scruffy stray look distinguished. "Well, look at you," Emily smiled, radiant in a simple white dress that caught the morning light. "Both of you, quite the handsome pair." Raymond offered his arm to his daughter, feeling a surge of emotion as she took it. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed, squeezing his arm gently. As they walked to the waiting car, Raymond glanced back at the forest edge one last time. Though no bobcat was visible among the trees, he felt Ash's presence nonetheless, a reminder that some connections transcend the visible, that some bonds remain even when paths diverge. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, following his gaze. Raymond smiled, turning back to his daughter, to the future unfolding before them. "Everything's perfect," he assured her, and meant it with his whole heart. At the lakeside pavilion, as family and friends gathered to witness new beginnings, Raymond stood tall beside his daughter, Scout sitting attentively at his feet. The ceremony unfolded with simple beauty, vows exchanged against a backdrop of mountains that had witnessed generations of such promises. When it came time to give Emily away, Raymond felt not loss, but completion, the rightness of cycles, of seasons, of love, extending beyond its original boundaries to create new configurations, new possibilities. Later, as twilight settled over the reception and guests danced beneath strings of lights, Raymond found a quiet moment with Marianne, both of them watching Emily and Michael share their first dance as husband and wife. "You seem well, Ray," Marianne said, using the nickname she'd abandoned years ago. "More at peace than I've seen you in a long time." "I am," Raymond acknowledged. "It took a while, but I finally figured out how to be still enough to see what's right in front of me." "Better late than never," she smiled, raising her glass in a small toast. "That seems to be my theme lately," Raymond chuckled, clinking his glass against hers. As the evening deepened into night, Raymond slipped away from the celebration, walking with Scout along the lakeshore. The moon cast a silver path across the water, and in the distance an owl called, a wild voice singing its ancient song. Raymond thought of Ash out there, somewhere in the darkness, teaching her grown children to navigate the world on their own terms. He thought of Emily, stepping into her new life with courage and joy. He thought of himself, no longer running from connection, but embracing it in all its complex, unpredictable forms. At the edge of the water, Raymond paused, Scout a warm presence against his leg. Together they stood, man and dog, watching the moonlight dance across the ripples, listening to the night sounds of the forest that had become home. "We made it," Raymond whispered, echoing words he'd once spoken to an injured bobcat kitten. "We all made it." Scout's tail wagged in quiet agreement as they turned and walked back toward the lights. The music, the celebration of beginnings that grew from endings, and the endless, miraculous cycle that connected them all. "So,